Right, so this is the prologue to the book, The Maiden Voyage of New York City. I hope you enjoy. Marcos Veracek sat at the prow of the motorboat as it sped down Wall Street Canal. At nearly 7 feet, his gaunt figure towered over the boat's captain and the two armed bodyguards who rode with him. A gentle breeze blew against his black suit and neatly trimmed dark hair. His nostrils filled with the scent of salt and seaweed. Just beneath that, the ever-present stink of sewage made him clench his teeth. To his right and left were the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Most had been built over 100 years ago. In that time, the sea had risen up to cover their first two floors. The gentle ebb and flow of the tides rested 3 feet below the high water line, halfway up the second floor windows. Circling each skyscraper were makeshift plastic walkways where a ship could dock and one could enter the new first floors. Plastic bags, tin cans, and 1,000 other knickknacks floated in the water. There was a bump against the boat as it hit something large. Marco had leaned to Marco had learned to ignore those, but a metallic clank made him peer down into the water where he spotted a tin lunchbox. The cover's faded paint depicted a man firing lasers from his eyes at a robot as the box bobbed and sank into the water amidst so much other debris. As the sun began to set, lights rose up inside the skyscrapers all the way to their tops. It was only the first few levels that remained unlit, leaving the canals in darkness. Marco looked down. The water was murky and filled with trash, but he thought he saw a street sign labeled Avenue of the Americas in the water. He grimaced. There was always the chance that a boat's underside might accidentally scratch a lamppost, street sign, or statue and start to sink. Marco hoped that their captain was expert enough to dodge the old signposts that threatened to scrape the bottom of the boat. He didn't want to swim in the cold Atlantic Ocean all the way to his destination. Beautiful night, the captain remarked. He had been a local hire, Marco's own, not a company man like the bodyguards. He hadn't learned to be solemn and silent. For the past few years, Marco had been in and out of meetings with the richest New York City had to offer, and normally would have leapt at the opportunity to banter with someone who didn't look down their nose at him. But he didn't feel like talking. Not now. Not tonight. Marco just wanted it to happen. Marco turned, smiling at the man. He had a thick beard, calloused hands, and leathery skin, but his eyes looked younger than Marco's. Couldn't have asked for a better night. There aren't any storms, barely even a wind. The weather report says there aren't any clouds. Marco concurred while looking up. Nearly every window above him was shining with light, and the sky between the buildings was a thin black abyss. You think it'll work? The captain asked innocently. Marco gave him an irritated look, which the captain appeared to have missed. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. I sure hope so, the captain continued, entirely missing his tone. If it has to happen, I hope it works. Of course, I might be out of business if it does. No, you won't, Marco stated, unsure, but sounding as if he wasn't. Things will be better than ever before. The man scoffed and looked past Marco. Marco turned, trying not to show his angry grimace. He preferred his workers to speak their minds to him in theory, but the people of New York City had an incurable strain of pessimism. Must be because they have to live in claustrophobic conditions within the skyscrapers. It drives them insane. There have been tests from decades ago where rats were put in the same cramped conditions as New Yorkers. They ate each other, and I'm pretty sure the rats weren't surrounded by water. Marco only had a few seconds to fume at the tactless captain of the most pathetic boat in the lagoon that was New York City when they finally arrived at their destination, the Empire State Building. While the other skyscrapers looked like lifeless blocks being swallowed by the sea, Marco thought that this tower barked defiance. Even as the first two floors had fallen beneath the waves, the monolith reached toward the sky, its segmented form growing thinner until its point seemed to reach up into the cosmos itself. Even the waves crashing against its eastern side looked majestic. It looked like the only skyscraper that could weather the storm, as if this spire was more eternal than the roaring seas themselves. The captain drew them up beside the makeshift dock. The guards were the first to leap out. With the exception of the few wealthy people who hadn't abandoned New York to the waves, every New Yorker had to have some knowledge of shipbearing. It was as if when the sea levels rose and the lights ran out, Gotham had turned into medieval Venice or Amsterdam. Or at least, that was one of the ways Marco described New York City as his mind tried to make sense of the improbability. Sir? A deep voice pulled Marco from his thoughts. Marco took the offered hand and stepped out of the boat. The crew paced around the building until they reached a window that had been expanded and fitted with a glass door. The single door was hardly as glamorous as the massive gilded rotating doors below, but those were filled with dogfish and eels. There were two guards with assault rifles standing on either side of the door. Marco paused and turned on his internal computer. The neural interface came up in front of his eyes, and a notification appeared asking if another user could wirelessly link into him. Marco turned his right hand palm up, and with his left index finger pressed on his right palm like a touchpad and pressed Grant Access. The guard jumped into the digital part of his brain and scanned his ID. When it had finished, the guard said, "Can you please step to the side?" The two bodyguards who had been accompanying Marco waited and did the same. Marco caught a flicker in their eyes as if they all knew each other, but protocol was protocol. When the men were scanned, the other security guard opened the door for them. Marco turned and gave one last look at the doubting captain, who had returned to his boat. "Sail out past the edge of Manhattan. It will be safest there." "You sounded so confident earlier." After a pause, the captain added, "I'll be sure to do that." Marco glared daggers at the captain. He had only meant... But the man had pulled back the line, tying him to the dock, and had his motor revving in the water. Marco wasn't going to try to educate the man by shouting over the engine. He turned, nodded at the security guard while muttering the little herd courtesy of thanks, and stepped inside. He was immediately hit with such an overpowering concentration of pine and lemon air freshener that his eyes watered. Humanity couldn't stop itself from receding below the waves, but it could get rid of the smell. I guess we deserve some credit for that. Where once had been segmented office spaces, there was now a grand open reception area. Couches rested in a line between the reception desk and the door, each with its own side table and antique lamp. Along the walls were romantic paintings of peaceful European landscapes filled with windmills and granaries and simple-dressed townsfolk. Despite their attempt to shut out the world, this place, in its brightly lit excess, still carried an air of the impending doom in its over-perfection. Waiting in front of the reception desk was a large man, half a head shorter than Marco, but with an enormous gut. The man had 3 chins. The first 2 and the rest of his round face were covered in white stubble that matched the thick hair on the top of his head. He wore a fine dark blue suit and sported an antique golden watch with inlaid diamonds on his left wrist. His clear blue eyes, which were friendly but distant, had locked onto Marco. Marco walked towards him, hearing the echo of his black dress shoes as he spanned the gap between them. "Sveracek," the man called as they approached. "Ready for tonight?" Marco wondered if he was asking if he was personally ready for the ceremony or if all the plans were ready and functioning. "Yes, Mr. Stanhope," a response that answered both questions. "Good," Stanhope nodded. "I managed to sneak away from the socialites for a second. I don't think they mind. They've mostly been congregating around me, but I suspect it's just because you haven't shown up yet. When you're ready, we can head to the observation deck." Marco nodded nervously. He didn't like social events, especially ones where he had to mingle with people above his class as he endured their judgment. It wasn't a good quality for a scientist to have, the inability to socialize with financiers. The two stepped around the reception desk, completely ignoring the middle-aged woman sitting behind it who was trying to look busy in front of her boss's boss's boss by typing madly onto a projected keyboard in between smiling at them. Stanhope pressed the button for the elevator. They stepped inside and were immediately hit with the cold putrescence of algae and salt water. Marco could imagine the pool of water that was just underneath their feet, filling the bottom of the elevator shaft. He looked at the buttons and saw that the first two had been removed. Good, he thought, and before he could stop himself, he imagined some careless pencil pusher, stressed from an upcoming deadline, accidentally hitting the wrong button and drowning inside a luxurious decorated elevator in the middle of what was once the capital of the world. The doors opened to a long golden hallway cut with red carpet. Marco had to temper his long strides as Stanhope waddled beside him. Stanhope opened the door at the end of the hallway and they stepped onto the roof of New York City. There was a slight burst of wind that tousled Marco's hair. To his right, a shining cube of light filled with elegantly dressed people whose eyes had been locked down at the rest of the skyscrapers turned to him. Without pausing for a view over the side, Marco followed Stanhope underneath the observation deck and up the stairs, emerging in the center of the party. Tables covered in white cloth with glasses of champagne and bouquets were spread across the room. All around them were men, the youngest in their 30s, but most in their 50s, in finely tailored suits, slick-gelled hair, and satin handkerchiefs. The women were noticeably younger than their male counterparts, each dressed in a myriad of shiny gray, deep blue, and even a handful of red, green, and black dresses. Marco guessed that the older women with austere clothing were the ones who had their own money. Marco noticed an exception to the age rule at the end of the bar, where a woman in her late 50s or early 60s, minus the plastic surgeries, stood beside a well-muscled, bronze-tanned, college-age boy who looked as if he were wearing his first suit. Marco smiled and saved that image. You have to smile now. Look friendly. This is a business world. It's all marketing, not the product. They'll trust you if you smile. The conversations began to die off as all eyes turned to the two giants, the one skeletal and the other walrus fat. They looked as if they didn't know how to respond. A few people broke out in cheers, more from a sense that that was what they were supposed to do than any actual enthusiasm for Marco. The hollow cheer spread throughout the room, and Marco was received to the least enthusiastic uproar he had ever heard. Stanhope marched forward, walking directly into the throng. Marco kept pace, fearing the inevitable introductions that were to follow. Esteemed guests, Marco Sveracek, the head of Project Sea Titan, inventor of the Sea Titan motors, and the man who will save the city tonight. A few glasses were raised. When does the show start? Asked one of the younger men, who stood beside a stunning Chinese woman in black. Stanhope turned to Marco, who looked at his watch. High tide is in 30 minutes, so an hour. Stanhope turned his head, nodding at the semicircular crowd. I think we can drink all the booze before then. That drew some laughter. An older man said, "You can," which drew a second round of laughs. After that, the majority of the crowd returned to their previous conversations, to Marco's relief. He stood quietly by Stanhope as he talked to an older French couple. Marco caught a few key words, but wasn't listening to them as he let his mind and ears wander. The talk of the people in the observation deck was slow, expectant, and almost dreading, but in a nonchalant manner, as if the specter of disaster was humorous. Every few seconds, Marco caught someone looking at him, then turning away. I am a sight to behold, 7 feet tall in a 3-year-old suit. I would have gotten a new one, but nice suits are expensive for a man like me to buy. Marco looked down and was reminded that his tie was comically short. They must all be thinking, what a poorly dressed freak he is. Who let him out of the lab? Or did he synthesize a Mother-Gross serum and break out? Maybe that's why he's so tall. Mr. Sveracek, a soft female voice called. Marco turned and looked down. A short Latina with soft upturned cheeks, dark almond eyes, and jet black hair looked up at him. She was wearing a green dress suit that looked somewhere in between stylish and businesslike. Her smile seemed more genuine than most of the others at the party. She reached out to shake his huge hand. "It's good to see you again." "Yes, Miss Mayor," he stuttered. So formal. Please call me Sophia." Yes, Sophia." "So are you enjoying the party, Mr. Sveracek?" "Yes." "Are you lying?" He paused long enough to give her a chance to answer her own question. "It's all right. I get bored of formal events too." "Yes, you're right," he smiled awkwardly. "I would prefer that things got started." Sophia's smile straightened and she nodded slightly. "Good. So you're confident?" Marco nodded. "Yes, I checked everything again today. Everything should go by without a hitch. Every variable has been calculated. Nothing is left to chance." Sophia's smile widened. "I wish there were more people like you in politics, people who could only tell the truth. It seems we get too much of the opposite. Try to enjoy the party." She sang as she turned. Marco gave an awkward nod just after she walked away and watched her join another group of socialites. Marco looked aside, trying to ignore his own thoughts. There was a waiter walking toward his small group with a tray of champagne. Marco grabbed a glass, wishing he could have grabbed two. Stanhope and the French couple each took a glass, and Marco realized he shouldn't act the drunkard in front of the only man who believed in him while he was trying to impress foreign business magnates. The couple kept talking to Stanhope, although they would occasionally look at Marco as if to be polite and acknowledge that he existed. "Oh, to hell with this." Marco walked away, not even bothering to give an excuse. He didn't care whether or not they started forming opinions about him. He had already formed enough about them. He walked to the window. Everything faded as he gazed out at the still drowning city. The gentle white waves upon the buildings looked like an almost peaceful struggle against the dark, cold water that was reaching up to claim them all. As high tide arrived, the water level began to rise until the first two floors of every skyscraper were fully underwater. The city workers were careful to scrape off the barnacles during the day, but there was a clear line on every skyscraper in Manhattan where the seawater had left its salty kiss. Marco glanced at his watch every few minutes until finally the moon hung above Manhattan. Not quite yet. It's not centered. Lights from every skyscraper were shining down on the dark brown waters. In the distance, smaller lights rose in a semicircle around the city. A third of the taller buildings in the boroughs had their lights on. More light came from the houseboats that filled the bay. Marco gazed down as far as the windows would let him. He had wanted to be as close to the ground floor as possible, but the financiers wanted to watch the spectacle from above. Marco looked down at the other skyscrapers and saw the bottom halves of each filled with people staring at the water below. Caught between the sea and space, millions watched and waited as the water rose to its highest level. Marco looked down at the engineering teams who were riding the waves in their boats. They were barely specks from this height. It didn't matter. He knew exactly where each of his machines were and could imagine every single bolt underneath the towers. Even at the top of the city, he imagined he felt the gentle thrum of the machine placed 1,000 feet below him. If this doesn't work, you will go down in history as a madman. Marco didn't even glance at the portly, fine-suited old man who happened to be his only supporter. You didn't have to be here. None of you had to be here. Stanhope knew who he was referring to, as the two had broken away from the larger gathering of the richest industrialists and real estate owners who had the misfortune of being unable to move their businesses out of the sinking city. Most of the time, innovation leads to disaster. Other times, it dominates the market, but either way, it is the future, and in this case, risks are unavoidable. If I don't die here now, I'll just die somewhere else in a less exciting fashion. Well, if this doesn't work, Marco choked out the nicety and imagined himself flinging the fat old man from the ledge, we'll be the only ones killed. Us and whoever is in the buildings that we fall on. Marco tuned him out. He looked at his watch, then back up at the moon. It's time, someone from behind Marco announced. Even with the handrails, no one dared to stand on the edge with Marco. Stanhope stretched awkwardly as he tried to put a hand on the tall man's shoulder before letting it rest on his back. Best of luck, he intoned, and abandoned him for his wife. The last of the engineers emerged from the water, climbed into the boats, and sped off. The rest could be done via remote. Marco saw the bubbles before the tremor worked its way up the building. A few people gasped. The champagne glasses tinkled. Dirty foam rose furiously at the base of the skyscraper as the machine began to work. Marco held his breath, hoping that the tiny holes beneath the concrete wouldn't create too strong a stream of pressurized water that might unbalance the delicate procedure. The skyscraper continued to shake. Glasses fell from tables, and cries rose from behind him. Marco looked out to the other buildings and saw the people watching open-mouthed as the tower shook. The Empire State Building began to rise. The massive engines at the building's base sputtered out water and calmed as the long-lost concrete sidewalk emerged as its newly reclaimed base. Then the Empire State Building grew still, fully detached from the sunken land. Cries of wonder became cheers, and as the people below cried out, Marco heard them echoed from behind him. Marco looked up at the moon. They had only risen 30 feet, but he felt as if he could reach out and grasp it. Marco looked over his shoulder, and everyone lifted their glasses to him. Then the socialites and billionaires turned to the company heads who funded the construction of the machines, hired the engineers, the congressmen, and women who hadn't done anything except calling it a bold initiative and gave tenuous support. Marco watched as they drank to their own futures. He put his left index finger on his right wrist. He tapped it twice, and the digital interface appeared before his eyes. He placed his left index finger on his open right palm and brought up a group chat application. Video of the engineering team scattered throughout the city appeared before his vision. Is everything working according to the plan? No malfunctions, even minor ones? No? Then activate the motors on the other buildings too. Marco tried to follow the engineering teams as they weaved through the canals, once streets of New York City, as he attempted to guess which building would be the next to rise. It was the one directly opposite him, and Marco almost laughed with joy as he saw the face of an astonished girl in a blue snowflake sweater clutching her mother, mouth agape, as she looked down at the waves, then back up toward the stars as if gauging the new difference. A future scientist. The buildings rose around him sporadically, sometimes a few in sequence. Once he saw 5 rise together in a line. By sunrise, every skyscraper was over 2 stories taller. Marco clutched the railing, exhausted, feeling as if he had just run a marathon. Stanhope appeared at his side. If only you had been at Atlantis. Marco laughed with joy and almost hugged him. Gulls cawed below him. In a night, I have reclaimed a city from the waves. I am the captain of New York City. So, that was the prologue.